Imagine being able to think more effectively, solve complex problems, and make better decisions in both your personal and professional life. What if I told you there's a formula for becoming a smarter thinker? Today we're diving into Matthew Allen's book, Smart Thinking, which provides a blueprint to develop practical thinking skills and strategies that will set you up for success in every area of life. Chapter 1. What is smart thinking? Picture this. You're standing in a bustling marketplace. There are sounds of conversations swirling around you, people rushing by, and countless products on display, each one clamoring for your attention. This marketplace is a metaphor for your mind, constantly bombarded by thoughts, ideas, distractions, and emotions. It's chaotic, unorganized, and if you're like most people, it's easy to get lost in the noise. Now imagine that someone hands you a map, a clear, structured way to navigate through the chaos. This is what smart thinking aims to do. From the very first chapter, Matthew Allen makes it clear that smart thinking isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about having a methodical approach to thinking that cuts through the noise and confusion. Allen opens by challenging a common misconception, the belief that intelligence is something you're born with and can't change. From the very beginning, he reassures us that smart thinking is not a gift bestowed upon a select few. Instead, it's a skill, a way of thinking that anyone can learn and develop. He explains that smart thinking is different from what most of us do every day. If you think back to a time when you've been overwhelmed by choices or emotions, you'll likely recognize what Allen describes as reactive thinking. This is the automatic, unstructured way most people think. It's impulsive, often emotional, and doesn't follow any real pattern. You react to the world around you, rather than taking control of your thoughts. Smart thinking, by contrast, is proactive. It's deliberate. It's about slowing down and structuring your thoughts in a way that helps you see the bigger picture. Imagine that marketplace again. But this time, instead of being overwhelmed by the chaos, you've got a well-organized list of exactly what you need and a clear route through the crowd. You know where you're going, you've got the tools you need, and you're prepared for the unexpected. Allen uses a simple analogy here. Thinking smart is like building a house. You wouldn't start throwing bricks together without a blueprint, right? You need a plan, a structure, and the right materials. Similarly, smart thinking requires a clear method, a way to approach problems logically and creatively. Allen stresses that at the core of smart thinking is knowledge, but not just any knowledge. He's not talking about memorizing trivia or facts. Instead, smart thinking is about how well you can connect what you know and apply it to new situations. Here's an example he gives. Think about learning how to drive a car. You don't just memorize the manual, you learn how the different parts of the car work together. The pedals, the steering wheel, the mirrors. They're all interconnected. And once you've mastered those connections, you can drive any car, not just the one you learned on. The same principle applies to smart thinking. It's about understanding how to connect different ideas, knowledge, and experiences, and using those connections to solve problems and make decisions. To illustrate this further, Allen introduces the concept of mental habits. These are the automatic ways we think about the world, often without realizing it. Some of these habits are helpful, like quickly recognizing a familiar face in a crowd. But others can hold us back, like making assumptions about a situation based on incomplete information. For example, let's say you've been asked to lead a new project at work. Immediately, your mind starts racing. I don't have enough experience for this, or what if I fail? These thoughts are based on assumptions, mental habits you've developed over time. But smart thinking asks you to pause, recognize those habits, and challenge them. Instead of letting your emotions dictate your actions, you start asking better questions. What do I know that can help me here? And what resources do I have to learn more? This ability to pause and rethink is a key part of smart thinking. It's not about being faster or more reactive. In fact, it's often about slowing down. Allen emphasizes that smart thinkers don't rush to conclusions. They take the time to gather the right information, consider different perspectives, and then make informed decisions. But how do you develop this habit of smart thinking? Allen introduces the idea of metacognition, thinking about your thinking. Imagine you're sitting in a meeting, and a problem comes up. A typical reaction might be to blurt out the first solution that comes to mind. But a smart thinker takes a step back and asks, how am I approaching this problem? What assumptions am I making? What information do I still need? This process of thinking about your own thinking allows you to become more aware of your mental habits and make better decisions. Alan likens this to being the driver of your own mind. Instead of being on autopilot, reacting to whatever comes your way, you take control of the wheel. You choose where to focus your attention, how to approach problems, and what information to use. This shift in mindset is the foundation of smart thinking. One of the biggest challenges to smart thinking, according to Alan, is the way our brains are wired. We're naturally inclined to take shortcuts. Our brains are designed to conserve energy, and that means we often rely on quick, instinctive judgments. While this can be helpful in some situations, like recognizing danger or making a quick decision, it's not always the best approach for more complex problems. Alan explains that smart thinking requires us to push against these natural tendencies. It's about training your brain to slow down, to question assumptions, and to think more deeply. This doesn't mean overthinking or getting stuck in analysis paralysis. Instead, it's about finding a balance, knowing when to trust your instincts and when to take a step back and think more critically. To wrap up the first chapter, Alan leaves us with a powerful takeaway. Smart thinking is a skill, and like any skill, it can be developed with practice. It's not about being born with a high IQ or having access to more information than others. It's about learning how to use the information you have in the most effective way possible. So, what's the first step towards smart thinking? It's simple. Start paying attention to how you think. Notice when you're reacting emotionally or making assumptions. Ask yourself better questions, and most importantly, take your time. Smart thinking isn't a race, it's a process, and with practice, you'll get better at it every day. Chapter 2. The Foundations of Smart Thinking. As we move into the next chapter, Alan takes us deeper into the nuts and bolts of smart thinking, focusing on the foundation that makes it all possible. Imagine again that you're trying to build a house. You wouldn't just start laying bricks without making sure the ground beneath you is solid, right? You need a strong foundation, or the whole structure could collapse. Smart thinking works in the same way. Without the right foundation, your thinking will be unstable and prone to errors. Alan begins by emphasizing the importance of knowledge. But he doesn't mean knowledge in the sense of memorizing endless facts or having a wealth of trivia stored up. Rather, it's about the right kind of knowledge and, more importantly, knowing how to use it. He makes a point that having access to information is not the same as knowing how to apply it effectively. It's like owning a toolbox, but not knowing which tool to use for the job. The hammer might be perfect for driving in nails, but if you try to use it for every task, you'll run into problems pretty quickly. In today's world, information is everywhere. We're constantly bombarded by it, through our phones, the internet, social media, conversations. But simply having access to more information doesn't make us better thinkers. In fact, Alan suggests that it can make us worse if we don't know how to sift through the noise and focus on what's important. Imagine standing in front of a bookshelf overflowing with books. It's one thing to have all that knowledge at your fingertips, but unless you can find the right book at the right time, that shelf is just clutter. So what does Alan mean by smart knowledge? He explains that it's not just about having a broad base of information, but about developing deep knowledge in key areas that are relevant to your goals or challenges. Think about the best problem solvers you know, whether they're leaders in business, scientists, or even a close friend who always seems to give the right advice. What sets them apart is their ability to draw on the right information at the right time. Take, for example, a doctor diagnosing a patient. They don't need to know everything about every possible medical condition at once. What they need is a deep understanding of the symptoms presented and how they relate to the possible diagnoses. Then, they apply their knowledge to figure out the best course of treatment. This is smart knowledge in action. It's targeted, it's relevant, and it's structured in a way that allows for quick access when needed. Alan also stresses that smart thinking requires more than just knowledge. It requires the ability to connect that knowledge in meaningful ways. This is where the concept of associative thinking comes into play. Associative thinking is the process of drawing connections between different pieces of information that might not seem related at first glance. This is one of the hallmarks of creative problem solving. Let's take a real-world example. Imagine you're a business owner trying to figure out how to boost sales. You've been focusing all your efforts on traditional advertising methods, but it's not working. Instead of sticking with what you know, associative thinking might lead you to draw inspiration from a completely different field, say, psychology. You remember reading about how people make decisions based on emotions, not just logic. That connection leads you to shift your advertising strategy, focusing more on emotional storytelling rather than just highlighting the features of your product. This kind of thinking opens up new possibilities and allows you to solve problems in creative, innovative ways. But how do you develop this kind of associative thinking? Alan offers a strategy that anyone can use. Expose yourself to a wide range of experiences and ideas. It might sound counterintuitive. After all, didn't he just say you need deep knowledge? But the trick is to balance depth with breadth. While it's important to develop expertise in specific areas, you also need to step outside your comfort zone and explore topics or fields that you're unfamiliar with. This cross-pollination of ideas is where associative thinking really comes to life. Alan likens this to building a mental web. The more diverse your knowledge base, the more connections your brain can make between different ideas. Imagine a spider's web. The more strands there are, the stronger it becomes. In the same way, the more diverse your experiences and knowledge, the better your brain becomes at making those connections. But Alan warns us not to confuse associative thinking with randomness. Smart thinking isn't about jumping to wild conclusions or making baseless connections. Instead, it's about recognizing patterns and using them to inform your thinking. He uses the example of Leonardo da Vinci, one of history's most famous polymaths. Da Vinci's genius wasn't just that he was skilled in many different areas. It was his ability to see connections between those areas. His understanding of anatomy informed his art, and his study of nature helped him design groundbreaking inventions. So, how can we begin to practice associative thinking in our everyday lives? One way, Alan suggests, is to make a habit of looking for patterns in the world around you. Whether it's in nature, in conversations, or even in your own thoughts, start paying attention to how things are connected. Over time, this habit of looking for patterns will sharpen your ability to draw meaningful connections between different ideas. As we move through the chapter, Alan also introduces the concept of cognitive load. This is a key idea for anyone who wants to improve their thinking skills, because it explains why we sometimes struggle to think clearly or make decisions. Cognitive load refers to the amount of mental effort being used in the working memory. Imagine your brain as a computer. The more tasks you have running at once, the slower it becomes. In the same way, if your brain is overloaded with information or distractions, your ability to think smart diminishes. Alan suggests that one of the best ways to reduce cognitive load is to simplify. This means organizing your thoughts, breaking down complex problems into smaller parts, and focusing on one thing at a time. He draws a comparison to how athletes train. If you've ever watched a professional runner, you'll notice how effortless they make it look. But that ease comes from years of training, from breaking down their movements into smaller parts and perfecting each one. In the same way, smart thinking requires practice and the ability to simplify complex tasks. To illustrate this, Alan gives the example of a chef in a busy kitchen. The chef doesn't panic when orders come flooding in. Instead, they break down the tasks into manageable steps. First, they gather the ingredients, then they prepare each dish methodically. They don't try to do everything at once, but rather focus on one step at a time. This is how smart thinkers operate. They reduce cognitive load by breaking down problems and focusing on the task at hand. By the end of the chapter, Alan leaves us with a clear message. Smart thinking isn't just about gathering information or solving problems quickly. It's about having a strong foundation of knowledge, the ability to connect that knowledge in creative ways, and the discipline to simplify and focus when needed. It's a skill that anyone can develop, But like any skill, it requires practice, patience, and a willingness to learn. This chapter serves as a critical turning point in the book, as it sets the stage for the more advanced thinking strategies that Alan will cover in later chapters. By understanding the foundations of smart thinking, knowledge, associative thinking, and cognitive load, we're better equipped to handle the challenges that life throws our way. We start to see that smart thinking is not about quick fixes or shortcuts, but about building a strong, adaptable mind that can tackle any problem, big or small. Chapter 3. How to Think More Effectively. In the third chapter of Smart Thinking, Matthew Allen takes us deeper into the mechanics of how we can train our minds to think more effectively. He has already laid the foundation by explaining the importance of knowledge, associative thinking, and reducing cognitive load. Now, Allen introduces practical strategies for turning these ideas into everyday habits, showing us that smart thinking is not just something you learn, it's something you practice continuously, like a skill. Imagine for a moment that you're standing in front of a giant puzzle. The pieces are scattered everywhere, and at first glance, it seems overwhelming. This is often how life feels when you're faced with complex problems or big decisions. But Allen reassures us that just like with any puzzle, there's a method to solving it. You don't have to tackle everything all at once. Instead, you can break it down into smaller, manageable parts. This is where Allen introduces the concept of chunking, one of the most effective methods for improving your thinking. Chunking is the process of breaking down large pieces of information into smaller, more digestible bits. Think of it like trying to eat a large meal. You wouldn't attempt to consume everything at once. Instead, you take small bites. The same principle applies to thinking. Allen illustrates this with an example from memory research. Studies have shown that people can only hold a limited amount of information in their working memory at any given time. But by chunking information into groups, we can remember and process much more. For example, if you're trying to remember a phone number, you might break it down into sections, say 123, 456, 7890. Instead of remembering 10 individual numbers, you're now only remembering 3 chunks. This makes it easier to recall and use the information when needed. Now, let's apply chunking to a more complex problem. Imagine you're tasked with organizing a big event. At first, it seems overwhelming. There are venues to book, people to invite, food to arrange, entertainment to plan. But instead of trying to juggle everything in your head, chunking allows you to break the problem into smaller categories: logistics, guest list, catering, and so on. By dividing the problem into chunks, you reduce cognitive overload and make it easier to focus on each part. This technique isn't just useful for organizing events or remembering phone numbers. It can be applied to almost any aspect of life. When you break down a big task or decision into smaller chunks, you make it more manageable. And once you master each chunk, you can put them together to form the complete picture. But Allen doesn't stop there. He dives deeper into how we can use chunking to become more effective problem solvers. One of the key points he makes is that chunking helps you identify patterns. When you start to see patterns in information, it becomes easier to understand and predict outcomes. For instance, if you're trying to solve a recurring issue at work, chunking the problem into its component parts might reveal a pattern you hadn't noticed before. Maybe it's not the workload that's the issue, but how tasks are being prioritized. By chunking the problem, you can step back and see the bigger picture. Allen also explains that chunking helps us with decision-making. When faced with a big decision, many people experience what's called decision fatigue. This happens when your brain becomes overwhelmed by too many choices, leading to poor decision-making or worse, decision paralysis. By chunking the decision-making process into smaller steps, you can avoid this fatigue. Instead of trying to decide everything all at once, you focus on one aspect at a time. For example, if you're deciding on a career change, you might start by chunking the decision into research, learning about new opportunities, preparation, updating your skills, and execution, applying for jobs. This approach reduces the pressure and makes the decision-making process more efficient. Another important strategy Alan highlights in this chapter is questioning assumptions. One of the reasons people struggle with thinking effectively is that they often operate on autopilot, relying on assumptions that might not be true. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you make a decision based on what you think you know, only to find out later that your assumptions were wrong? Alan encourages us to develop the habit of questioning our assumptions before making any decision. Let's say you're working on a project and you assume that everyone on your team agrees with the approach you're taking. This assumption might cause you to overlook potential problems until it's too late. But if you question your assumptions from the start, by checking in with your team, asking for feedback, and exploring alternative solutions, you avoid potential pitfalls and make smarter decisions. Alan reminds us that questioning assumptions isn't about being skeptical of everything. It's about being mindful. It's about taking a step back and asking, is this really true? What evidence do I have to support this belief? This simple habit can have a profound effect on how you think, leading to better outcomes in both your personal and professional life. To help us develop this skill, Alan suggests we regularly engage in what he calls thought experiments. These are mental exercises where you imagine different scenarios, question your assumptions, and explore alternative outcomes. For example, if you're planning a trip and you assume that the weather will be perfect, a thought experiment might lead you to ask, what if it rains? What's my backup plan? By exploring these possibilities in advance, you prepare yourself for any outcome and reduce the likelihood of being caught off guard. One of the most powerful parts of this chapter is Alan's discussion on deliberate practice. Smart thinking, like any other skill, requires practice. It's not enough to just read about these strategies. You need to apply them consistently in your life. Think about athletes or musicians. They don't become great by accident. They practice, refine their techniques, and learn from their mistakes. The same is true for thinking. Alan introduces the idea of meta-thinking, or thinking about your thinking. This means regularly reflecting on how you approach problems, decisions, and challenges. By becoming more aware of your thinking patterns, you can identify areas where you need to improve and actively work on them. It's like being your own coach, constantly evaluating your performance and finding ways to get better. He encourages us to start small. Don't try to overhaul your thinking overnight. Instead, pick one area of your life, whether it's decision-making, problem-solving, or communication, and focus on applying smart thinking strategies to that area. Over time, as these habits become ingrained, you'll find that you're naturally thinking smarter in all aspects of your life. By the end of the chapter, Alan brings everything together with a powerful message. Smart thinking is a skill that anyone can develop, but it requires effort, practice, and intentionality. It's about breaking down complex problems into manageable chunks, questioning assumptions, and consistently refining your thinking process through deliberate practice. With these strategies, you're not just thinking more effectively, you're thinking strategically, preparing yourself to handle whatever challenges come your way. This chapter serves as a practical guide to implementing smart thinking in everyday life. It's a reminder that while thinking may seem like a natural process, effective thinking requires discipline, focus, and a commitment to continuous improvement. The more you practice these techniques, the more intuitive they become, transforming the way you approach problems, decisions, and life as a whole. Chapter 4. Applying Smart Thinking in Daily Life. As we step into Chapter 4 of Smart Thinking, Matthew Allen shifts the focus from theory to practice. So far, we've explored the foundations of smart thinking, learned how to organize our thoughts with chunking, and how to question assumptions. Now, Allen takes us by the hand and leads us through the process of applying these concepts in real-life situations. This is where the rubber meets the road, where smart thinking becomes more than just a mental exercise. It transforms into something you actively use to improve your life every day. Imagine waking up in the morning, your mind filled with the day's tasks. You're already thinking about the work projects you need to finish, the errands you have to run, and the endless stream of responsibilities awaiting you. For many people, This mental clutter creates stress and reduces their ability to think clearly and effectively. Alan understands this, and he begins this chapter by addressing a common problem we all face: overwhelm. According to Alan, one of the reasons we struggle with thinking effectively in daily life is that we're bombarded with too many decisions, too much information, and too many distractions. Our minds are constantly trying to juggle a million things at once, which leads to mental fatigue. Alan suggests that smart thinkers are proactive about managing this mental clutter. They don't just let their thoughts run wild, they actively take control. How? The first technique Alan introduces in this chapter is mental decluttering. Just like you would clean and organize a messy desk, you need to regularly declutter your mind. Alan suggests starting each day with a simple mental exercise. Before diving into the tasks of the day, take a few minutes to clear your head. This could be through mindfulness, meditation, or simply sitting in silence and focusing on your breathing. The goal is to create space in your mind so that you can approach the day with clarity. But mental decluttering isn't just about finding peace, it's about setting priorities. Alan emphasizes the importance of focused thinking. Once you've cleared your mind, the next step is to decide what really matters. Instead of letting your mind jump from task to task in a reactive way, Alan advises starting your day by identifying your top priorities. Ask yourself, what's the most important thing I need to accomplish today? By narrowing your focus, you reduce cognitive overload and ensure that your energy is directed toward what truly matters. Alan tells us a story of a highly successful entrepreneur who used this technique religiously. Every morning, she would write down her 3 most important tasks for the day, no more, no less. This wasn't a to-do list of mundane tasks. These were the high-impact activities that would move her closer to her long-term goals. Everything else, emails, meetings, minor tasks, was secondary. This level of focus allowed her to make significant progress on her projects, while many of her peers were bogged down by less important tasks. Next, Alan introduces the concept of decision filtering. One of the main reasons people struggle with thinking effectively is that they don't have a system for making decisions. We're often faced with dozens, if not hundreds, of decisions every day, and without a framework, it's easy to get lost in the noise. Alan suggests that smart thinkers use filters to help them make better decisions, faster. What does this mean in practice? Think of it like this. When you're making a big purchase, you probably have criteria you use to evaluate your options. Maybe you're buying a car, and your criteria include price, fuel efficiency, and reliability. You wouldn't just buy the first car you see. Instead, you use these filters to narrow down your options and make a smart choice. Alan suggests applying the same kind of filtering to everyday decisions. Before making any decision, ask yourself, what criteria are most important here? This could be time, cost, impact, or even your own values. By filtering your decisions through these criteria, you simplify the process and avoid getting stuck in analysis paralysis. To make this even more practical, Alan recommends creating a personal set of decision filters based on your goals and values. For example, if your goal is to live a healthier lifestyle, your decision filter might be, will this decision support my health and well-being? If your focus is on career growth, your filter might be, does this decision bring me closer to my professional goals? By having these filters in place, you make decisions more quickly and with greater confidence, knowing they're aligned with your long-term objectives. But smart thinking isn't just about managing your time and making decisions. It's also about solving problems effectively. Alan spends a significant portion of this chapter diving into problem-solving techniques that can help you think more strategically when faced with challenges. One of the most powerful techniques he introduces is reverse thinking. Most of the time when we approach a problem, we start by thinking about solutions. But Alan suggests flipping the process. Instead of starting with solutions, start with the desired outcome and work backward. This technique forces you to think in reverse, which often leads to more creative and effective solutions. Let's say you're trying to increase sales for your business. Instead of jumping straight to tactics like marketing or promotions, start by imagining the outcome you want. Maybe it's doubling your sales in the next 6 months. Now, work backward from that goal. What needs to happen for that to be a reality? What resources do you need? What obstacles might you face? By reverse engineering the process, you can identify the most critical steps and focus your efforts on the actions that will have the biggest impact. Reverse thinking is especially useful for complex problems where the solution isn't immediately clear. It allows you to break down the problem into smaller, more manageable parts and approach it from a new angle. Alan gives the example of the Apollo 13 mission, where NASA engineers used reverse thinking to bring the astronauts back to Earth after their spacecraft malfunctioned. Instead of focusing on the immediate problem, the damaged oxygen tank, the engineers started with the desired outcome, getting the astronauts home safely, and worked backward to figure out how to achieve it with the limited resources they had. This kind of thinking not only saved lives but also became a model for how to approach seemingly unsolvable problems. As Alan walks us through these techniques, he keeps reinforcing one key point. Smart thinking is proactive, not reactive. It's about taking control of your thoughts, decisions, and actions, rather than letting circumstances dictate them. He compares smart thinking to playing a game of chess. A novice player reacts to their opponent's moves, but a skilled player thinks several moves ahead. They anticipate challenges, plan their strategy, and adjust as needed. In the same way, smart thinkers are always thinking ahead, preparing for what's to come, rather than reacting to what's happening in the moment. Alan's advice for applying smart thinking in daily life doesn't stop with decision-making and problem-solving. He also touches on the importance of self-awareness. This might seem like a softer, less technical skill, but Alan argues that self-awareness is one of the most critical components of smart thinking. Without it, you're likely to fall into the same mental traps and biases over and over again. He encourages us to regularly check in with ourselves and ask, how am I thinking? Am I reacting emotionally, or am I thinking strategically? By developing self-awareness, you can catch yourself when you're falling into reactive thinking patterns and course correct before it's too late. To make this concept more concrete, Alan suggests keeping a thought journal. This isn't just a diary of your daily activities, but a place where you can reflect on your thinking processes. After you've made a decision or solved a problem, take a few minutes to write down how you approached it. What strategies did you use? What worked and what didn't? Over time, this practice of reflecting on your thinking helps you spot patterns and improve your decision-making and problem-solving skills. In addition to self-awareness, Alan stresses the importance of emotional regulation. Emotions, while an essential part of being human, can cloud our judgment and lead to poor decisions if we're not careful. Smart thinkers know how to manage their emotions, especially in high-pressure situations. Alan suggests practicing techniques like deep breathing, mindfulness, and even visualization to keep your emotions in check. This doesn't mean ignoring your emotions. Rather, it means acknowledging them without letting them dictate your actions. As we reach the end of the chapter, Alan leaves us with a final takeaway. Smart thinking isn't something you do once and forget about. It's a skill you build over time, one that requires continuous practice and refinement. By applying these techniques, mental decluttering, focused thinking, decision filtering, reverse thinking, self-awareness, and emotional regulation, you can transform the way you think and approach life's challenges with greater clarity and confidence. Chapter 5: Overcoming Mental Barriers to Smart Thinking. In Chapter 5, Matthew Allen addresses a critical issue we all face: the mental barriers that prevent us from thinking effectively. Imagine this scenario. You've read all about smart thinking, learned the strategies, and are excited to apply them in your life. But then, despite your best intentions, you find yourself falling back into old patterns of thinking. Maybe it's stress, maybe it's the pressure of a situation, or maybe it's just bad habits. This chapter is about overcoming those obstacles that get in the way of our ability to think smartly, consistently. Alan opens by explaining that mental barriers are often invisible to us. They creep into our thinking subtly, making it hard to recognize when they're at play. These barriers manifest as biases, habits, and emotional responses that cloud our judgment and limit our ability to think clearly. But here's the good news. Once we become aware of these barriers, we can take steps to overcome them. The first mental barrier Alan tackles is cognitive bias. If you've ever found yourself making the same mistake over and over again, despite having all the information you need to avoid it, you've probably fallen victim to cognitive bias. Alan describes biases as shortcuts our brains take to simplify decision-making. While these shortcuts can be useful in certain situations, they often lead us astray when we're dealing with more complex problems. Take the confirmation bias, for example. This is the tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe while ignoring information that contradicts it. Imagine you're trying to decide whether to invest in a new business venture. If you're already excited about the idea, you might focus only on the positive feedback and overlook the risks. Alan points out that this bias can blind us to important details, leading us to make decisions based on incomplete or skewed information. So how do we overcome cognitive biases? Alan suggests that the first step is simply being aware of them. Once you recognize that your brain is wired to take these shortcuts, you can start to question your thinking. He encourages us to actively seek out contradictory evidence when making decisions. If you're excited about a business idea, challenge yourself to look for reasons why it might not work. This doesn't mean becoming overly negative or pessimistic. It means taking a balanced approach and making sure you've considered all sides of the issue. Another powerful tool for overcoming cognitive bias is diverse perspectives. Alan explains that one of the reasons we fall into biased thinking is that we often operate in echo chambers. We surround ourselves with people who think like us, read books that reinforce our views, and consume media that aligns with our beliefs. While this can feel comfortable, it limits our ability to think critically. Alan suggests that smart thinkers make a habit of seeking out different perspectives. This could mean talking to people with different backgrounds, engaging with opposing viewpoints, or reading books and articles that challenge your beliefs. By exposing yourself to diverse ideas, you can break out of the echo chamber and avoid falling into the trap of confirmation bias. Alan reminds us that the goal isn't to adopt every new perspective you encounter, but to consider them thoughtfully and use them to refine your own thinking. The next mental barrier Alan discusses is emotional reasoning. Emotions are powerful drivers of our behavior, and while they can sometimes lead us to make good decisions, they can also cloud our judgment. Have you ever made a decision in the heat of the moment, only to regret it later? That's emotional reasoning at work. Alan points out that when we let emotions dictate our thinking, we're more likely to make impulsive, short-sighted decisions. To overcome this barrier, Alan introduces the concept of emotional detachment. This doesn't mean ignoring your emotions or pretending they don't exist. Rather, it's about learning to separate your emotional responses from your decision-making process. Imagine you're in a heated argument with a colleague. Your immediate emotional response might be to lash out or defend your position, but smart thinking requires you to step back and assess the situation more objectively. Alan suggests that one way to practice emotional detachment is through timeouts. When you find yourself in a situation where emotions are running high, give yourself permission to take a break before making any decisions. This could be as simple as stepping away from the conversation for a few minutes, or it could mean sleeping on a decision before acting on it. The goal is to create space between your emotional reaction and your thought process, allowing you to approach the situation with a clearer mind. But what about long-term emotional responses, like stress or anxiety? These emotions can be just as damaging to our thinking as momentary bursts of anger or frustration. Alan explains that chronic stress can impair our ability to think clearly, make decisions, and solve problems. When we're stressed, our brains go into survival mode, focusing on immediate threats rather than long-term solutions. To combat this, Alan emphasizes the importance of self-care. Smart thinking isn't just about mental strategies. It's also about taking care of your physical and emotional well-being. He encourages readers to prioritize activities that reduce stress, such as exercise, meditation, or spending time in nature. By managing stress, you create the mental clarity needed to think effectively. Another barrier to smart thinking that Alan highlights is habitual thinking. This is the tendency to fall into familiar patterns of thought, even when those patterns no longer serve us. Have you ever found yourself stuck in a rut, doing things the same way over and over again, even though it's not working? That's habitual thinking at play. Alan explains that habitual thinking is comfortable because it's familiar. Our brains like routines. They're efficient and require less cognitive effort. But smart thinkers know that just because something is familiar doesn't mean it's the best approach. To break out of habitual thinking, Alan encourages us to practice creative thinking. This means actively seeking out new ways of doing things, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. One technique he suggests is reframing. Reframing is the process of looking at a problem or situation from a different perspective. For example, if you're struggling with a project at work, instead of focusing on the difficulties, try reframing the situation as an opportunity to learn something new. By changing the way you look at the problem, you open yourself up to new solutions. Alan also introduces the idea of playful thinking. Sometimes the best way to break out of habitual thinking is to approach a problem with a sense of play. He tells the story of a famous advertising executive who, when faced with a creative block, would play with children's toys to stimulate his imagination. This might sound silly, but Alan explains that play activates parts of the brain that are associated with creativity and problem solving. By letting go of rigid thinking and allowing yourself to play, you can often find innovative solutions that wouldn't have occurred to you otherwise. As we near the end of the chapter, Alan touches on one of the most common barriers to smart thinking: fear of failure. Many people avoid thinking outside the box or trying new things because they're afraid of making mistakes. But Alan argues that failure is an essential part of the learning process. Smart thinkers aren't afraid to fail. They embrace failure as an opportunity to learn and grow. Alan suggests that one of the best ways to overcome the fear of failure is to redefine success. Instead of measuring success by whether or not you achieved a specific outcome, measure it by how much you learned in the process. If you approach every challenge as an opportunity to learn, failure becomes less intimidating. It's no longer something to be feared, but something to be embraced. He also recommends practicing low-stakes failure. This means deliberately putting yourself in situations where failure is a possibility, but where the consequences are minor. For example, you might try learning a new skill, like playing an instrument or speaking a new language, where mistakes are inevitable but the stakes are low. By becoming more comfortable with failure in these low-risk situations, you build the resilience needed to take on bigger challenges without fear. In the final section of the chapter, Alan leaves us with a powerful reminder. Overcoming mental barriers to smart thinking is an ongoing process. It's not something you do once and then forget about. Just like physical exercise, mental fitness requires regular practice. By consistently challenging your biases, questioning your habitual thinking, managing your emotions, and embracing failure, you can develop the mental strength needed to think smarter every day. Alan's message in this chapter is clear. While we all face mental barriers, they are not insurmountable. With awareness, practice, and the right strategies, we can overcome these obstacles and unlock the full potential of our minds. The path to smart thinking isn't always easy, but it's one worth taking. Because when you learn to think smarter, you gain the ability to tackle life's challenges with confidence, creativity, and clarity. Chapter 6: Enhancing Problem Solving with Smart Thinking. In Chapter 6 of Smart Thinking, Matthew Allen takes us deeper into the world of problem solving. By now, we've learned about the mental barriers that can get in the way of thinking smartly, and we've developed strategies to overcome them. But the true test of smart thinking lies in how we approach and solve problems, both big and small. This chapter is all about sharpening your problem-solving abilities, using the techniques we've explored so far, and adding new ones to your arsenal. Alan begins by emphasizing that problem-solving isn't just a skill for scientists, engineers, or CEOs. It's something we all need to do every day. From deciding how to handle a difficult conversation to figuring out the best way to tackle a project at work, problems come in all shapes and sizes. But the key difference between average thinkers and smart thinkers is how they approach those problems. To frame the discussion, Alan introduces the idea of problem orientation. Most people, when faced with a problem, react with frustration, stress, or avoidance. It's a natural response. Problems often represent obstacles, disruptions to our plans, or challenges we feel unequipped to handle. But smart thinkers see problems not as threats, but as opportunities to improve, grow, and innovate. Imagine for a moment that you're faced with a significant work challenge. Maybe a project has hit a snag, or a client is unhappy. Your immediate reaction might be to feel overwhelmed or to blame others. But Alan encourages us to reframe these problems by adopting a growth mindset. Instead of thinking, "Why is this happening to me?" ask yourself, "What can I learn from this, and how can I improve the situation?" One of the first techniques Alan introduces to enhance problem solving is problem reframing. We've touched on reframing in earlier chapters, but here, Alan dives deeper into how it can be applied specifically to problem solving. He explains that how you define a problem significantly impacts how you solve it. Often, we approach problems from a limited perspective, focusing only on the immediate issue in front of us. But what if the problem you think you're solving isn't the real problem at all? To illustrate this, Alan shares a story about a tech company that was struggling to improve the efficiency of its software. The team was focused on making the code run faster, investing weeks of effort into optimization. However, the real issue wasn't the software's speed, it was that users didn't understand how to use the product efficiently. By reframing the problem as a user experience issue rather than a technical one, the team was able to develop better tutorials and guides, ultimately solving the real issue. This leads to one of the core ideas of the chapter, the importance of identifying the root cause. Many times, we waste time and energy trying to solve surface-level problems without digging deep enough to find the underlying cause. Alan encourages us to adopt a more analytical approach, using techniques like the 5 whys method. This simple but powerful tool involves asking why 5 times, or as many times as necessary, to drill down to the root cause of a problem. For example, let's say you're constantly missing deadlines at work. You might start by asking, "Why am I missing deadlines?" The answer might be, "Because I have too much on my plate." Then you ask again, "Why do I have too much on my plate?" The next answer might be, "Because I'm not delegating tasks effectively." As you continue this process, you might discover that the root cause is poor time management or a lack of communication with your team. By identifying the root cause, you can target your solution more effectively. Once you've identified the root cause, Alan suggests another advanced technique for problem solving: hypothesis-driven thinking. This method, often used by scientists and consultants, involves approaching problems with a specific hypothesis or theory in mind, then testing that hypothesis through experimentation. It's a systematic way of solving problems that ensures you're not just guessing at solutions, but are testing them in a structured way. Here's how it works. First, you define your hypothesis. This is your educated guess about what the problem is and how to solve it. For example, let's say you're running an online store and sales have dropped. Your hypothesis might be, sales have dropped because the website is difficult to navigate. Next, you test your hypothesis. You could run user tests or A/B tests with different website designs to see if simplifying the navigation leads to an increase in sales. If your hypothesis proves correct, you've found your solution. If not, you refine your hypothesis and test again. Hypothesis-driven thinking forces you to be disciplined in your approach to problem solving. Instead of jumping to conclusions or implementing solutions without evidence, you rely on data and experimentation to guide your decisions. Alan notes that this method is particularly useful for complex or ambiguous problems where the right solution isn't immediately obvious. But problem solving isn't just about finding the right solution. It's also about being efficient. Alan introduces the concept of Pareto thinking, also known as the 80-20 rule. This principle states that 80% of the results come from 20% of the effort. In the context of problem solving, this means that not all actions or solutions are equally important. Smart thinkers focus their energy on the 20% of solutions that will yield the biggest impact. Let's say you're trying to improve productivity at work. You could make dozens of small changes, from tweaking your schedule to reorganizing your workspace. But Pareto thinking would encourage you to focus on the few changes that will make the biggest difference. Maybe it's reducing the number of meetings you attend or setting clear boundaries for deep work. By focusing on these high-impact actions, you maximize your results while minimizing wasted effort. One of the most important lessons in this chapter is that problem-solving isn't a linear process. Alan explains that smart thinkers know how to iterate. Iteration is the process of continuously refining and improving your solution through trial and error. When solving complex problems, the first solution you try might not be the best one, and that's okay. The key is to learn from each attempt, make adjustments, and try again. Alan gives the example of Thomas Edison, who famously failed thousands of times before successfully inventing the light bulb. Instead of seeing each failure as a setback, Edison viewed them as learning opportunities, bringing him closer to the right solution. This iterative mindset is crucial for smart thinking. It encourages resilience, creativity, and persistence, all of which are essential for solving difficult problems. As Alan walks us through these techniques, he emphasizes the importance of balancing logical thinking with creative thinking. Problem-solving often requires both. Logical thinking helps you analyze the problem, break it down into its component parts, and approach it methodically. Creative thinking, on the other hand, allows you to see the problem from new angles, come up with innovative solutions, and think outside the box. Alan suggests practicing brainstorming sessions where you deliberately switch between logical and creative thinking modes. For example, if you're working with a team, you might start by analyzing the problem logically, gathering data, identifying constraints, and defining the desired outcome. Then, you switch gears and encourage free-flowing, creative thinking. No idea is too crazy at this stage. The goal is to generate as many solutions as possible. Afterward, you can return to logical thinking to evaluate and refine those ideas. This balance between logic and creativity is what makes smart thinking so powerful. Too much logic can lead to rigid, narrow thinking, while too much creativity can result in unrealistic or impractical solutions. Smart thinkers know how to harness the best of both worlds, using logic to structure their thinking and creativity to break free from conventional approaches. As the chapter comes to a close, Alan leaves us with a final, crucial point. Smart problem solvers are adaptable. They understand that no matter how well you plan or how much data you gather, unexpected challenges will always arise. The ability to adapt, to pivot when needed, to revise your approach in the face of new information, is one of the defining characteristics of a smart thinker. Alan shares the story of a well-known company that faced a crisis when their product unexpectedly failed in the market. Instead of stubbornly sticking to their original strategy, the leadership team quickly adapted, using customer feedback to redesign the product and relaunch it successfully. This adaptability allowed them to turn a potential disaster into a success story. Alan urges us to cultivate this adaptability in our own problem-solving efforts. He encourages us to embrace uncertainty, be open to new information, and remain flexible in our thinking. The smartest thinkers are not the ones who never fail. They're the ones who know how to learn from failure, adapt, and keep moving forward. Chapter 7. Advanced Techniques for Mastering Smart Thinking. In Chapter 7, Matthew Allen takes us into the realm of advanced smart thinking techniques. By now, we've developed a solid foundation, understanding how to overcome mental barriers, improve problem solving, and balance logical and creative thinking. But there's always room to grow, and in this chapter, Allen introduces more sophisticated strategies that will elevate your thinking to the next level. He begins by reminding us that smart thinking is a skill that must continually evolve. Just as athletes don't stop training once they reach a certain level, smart thinkers don't stop refining their mental abilities. In this chapter, Allen challenges us to take everything we've learned and apply it in even more deliberate, strategic ways. One of the first advanced techniques Allen introduces is systems thinking. This method involves looking at problems not as isolated events, but as part of a larger system. Think of systems thinking like zooming out on a map. Instead of focusing on one small detail, you see how all the different parts of the map are connected and influence each other. Alan explains that many of the problems we face in life are not standalone issues, but are part of broader systems, whether they're workplace dynamics, personal relationships, or global challenges. Take, for example, a company experiencing high employee turnover. On the surface, the problem might seem to be low morale or poor management. But through systems thinking, you might realize that the issue is connected to deeper organizational problems, such as unclear career paths, poor communication, or a lack of work-life balance. By zooming out and seeing the whole system, you can identify the root causes and come up with more effective solutions. Alan argues that systems thinking is particularly important in today's complex, interconnected world. Problems are rarely simple, and trying to solve them in isolation often leads to unintended consequences. Systems thinking encourages you to consider the ripple effects of your decisions and to anticipate how different elements of a system will interact with each other. One practical way to apply systems thinking is through mapping. This involves visually mapping out the different components of a problem and how they're connected. Imagine you're trying to improve productivity at work. Instead of focusing solely on individual performance, you might map out how factors like team dynamics, workload distribution, company culture, and available resources are all interconnected. By seeing the whole system, you can identify leverage points, the areas where small changes can lead to big improvements. Next, Alan delves into a strategy he calls strategic foresight. This technique is all about thinking ahead, anticipating future challenges, and planning for them in advance. It's similar to playing chess. A smart chess player doesn't just think about their next move, but the next 5 moves. Strategic foresight allows you to plan for different possible outcomes and prepare for them, reducing the likelihood of being caught off guard. Alan explains that one of the biggest mistakes people make is being too focused on the present. While it's important to solve immediate problems, smart thinkers also take the time to think about the future. They ask questions like, what are the potential long-term consequences of this decision? And how might this situation evolve over time? To practice strategic foresight, Alan recommends using scenario planning. This involves imagining different possible futures and developing plans for each one. For example, let's say you're starting a new business. Instead of just focusing on getting the business off the ground, strategic foresight would encourage you to think about different scenarios that could play out over the next few years. What if your market grows rapidly? What if new competitors emerge? What if economic conditions change? By planning for these different scenarios, you're better equipped to adapt and succeed, no matter what the future holds. Alan also emphasizes that strategic foresight isn't about predicting the future with certainty. That's impossible. Instead, it's about preparing for uncertainty. By thinking ahead and considering multiple possibilities, you become more agile and resilient when unexpected challenges arise. Building on this idea of thinking ahead, Alan introduces another advanced technique: pre-mortem analysis. Most people are familiar with post-mortems, which involve analyzing what went wrong after a failure has occurred. A pre-mortem flips this on its head. It's an exercise where you imagine that a project or decision has failed in the future, and then you work backward to figure out why it failed. This approach helps you identify potential pitfalls before they happen and allows you to address them proactively. Imagine you're launching a new product. A pre-mortem would involve gathering your team and asking, let's imagine this product launch was a complete disaster. What went wrong? By thinking through all the ways the project could fail, poor market research, inadequate marketing, manufacturing delays, you can take steps to mitigate these risks before they become real problems. Alan explains that the pre-mortem analysis is one of the most effective ways to avoid blind spots. Too often, we get caught up in the excitement of a new idea or project and overlook potential risks. By forcing yourself to think about failure in advance, you approach the situation with more caution and foresight, leading to better outcomes. Next, Alan introduces decision trees as a tool for smart thinkers. A decision tree is a visual representation of the different choices you can make and their potential consequences. It helps you map out complex decisions in a structured way, making it easier to weigh the pros and cons of each option. For example, let's say you're deciding whether to invest in a new business venture. A decision tree would allow you to break down the decision into its different components. If you invest, what are the potential outcomes? If the business succeeds, what's the upside? If it fails, what's the downside? By mapping out these different paths, you can see the decision more clearly and make a more informed choice. Alan explains that decision trees are particularly useful when you're faced with high-stakes decisions that have multiple possible outcomes. They force you to think through all the possibilities and help you avoid making impulsive or emotional decisions. In this chapter, Alan also touches on the concept of mental models. Mental models are frameworks or patterns of thinking that help you understand and navigate the world. Smart thinkers use mental models to simplify complex problems and make better decisions. One of the most famous mental models is Occam's razor, which states that when faced with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, the simplest one is usually correct. Alan encourages readers to develop a toolbox of mental models that they can draw on in different situations. For example, the 80-20 rule, Pareto principle, is a mental model that helps you focus on the actions that will have the biggest impact. The first principles thinking model, popularized by Elon Musk, involves breaking down a problem to its most basic elements and then building a solution from the ground up. By using these mental models, you can approach problems more efficiently and avoid getting bogged down in unnecessary complexity. Alan suggests that smart thinkers actively seek out new mental models and practice applying them in different situations. The more models you have in your toolbox, the better equipped you are to handle any challenge that comes your way. As the chapter draws to a close, Alan introduces one final advanced technique: lateral thinking. This is the ability to think creatively and come up with unconventional solutions to problems. Lateral thinking often involves challenging assumptions, breaking free from traditional ways of thinking, and approaching problems from a completely different angle. Alan tells the story of a famous lateral thinking exercise used by advertising legend Alex Osborne, who invented the idea of brainstorming. In one instance, a client was struggling to sell a particular product. Instead of focusing on traditional marketing strategies, Osborne encouraged his team to think laterally by asking, "What would happen if we marketed this product to an entirely different audience?" This unconventional approach led to a breakthrough idea, and the product became a huge success. Lateral thinking is about breaking the rules, or at least challenging them, to find new solutions. Alan encourages readers to practice lateral thinking by deliberately looking for new, unconventional ways to approach problems. He suggests starting with small problems in your daily life, experimenting with creative solutions, and gradually applying this mindset to bigger challenges. In conclusion, Alan reinforces that mastering smart thinking is a lifelong journey. The advanced techniques in this chapter, systems thinking, strategic foresight, pre-mortem analysis, decision trees, mental models, and lateral thinking, are powerful tools that will elevate your ability to solve problems, make decisions, and navigate complex situations. But like any skill, these techniques require practice. The more you use them, the sharper your thinking will become, allowing you to approach life's challenges with confidence and creativity. Chapter 8: Maintaining and Refining Smart Thinking for Long-Term Success. In Chapter 8 of Smart Thinking, Matthew Allen brings everything together, focusing on how to sustain and continually refine smart thinking throughout your life. He emphasizes that mastering smart thinking isn't a destination. It's a lifelong journey. The goal is not just to acquire these skills, but to keep them sharp, adapt them to new situations, and evolve your thinking as the world around you changes. This chapter is a blueprint for ensuring that smart thinking remains a consistent, growing part of your life, long after you've finished reading the book. Alan begins by acknowledging a key truth. We live in a fast-changing world. Technology, social norms, and industries are evolving rapidly, and what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. Smart thinkers know that to stay ahead, they must continually adapt their thinking to new information, new challenges, and new environments. Alan uses the analogy of a river. Smart thinking is like water flowing downstream, adjusting and reshaping itself as it encounters obstacles. To be successful in the long term, we must be like that river, flexible and ever-evolving. One of the first strategies Alan suggests for maintaining smart thinking is lifelong learning. He explains that smart thinkers never stop learning. They see every situation as an opportunity to acquire new knowledge. This doesn't mean you need to go back to school or take endless online courses, though those can be valuable. Instead, it's about cultivating a mindset of curiosity. Smart thinkers ask questions, seek out new perspectives, and remain open to changing their minds when presented with new information. Alan shares the example of a well-known entrepreneur who made it a habit to read books across a wide range of subjects, from business to science to philosophy. This constant exposure to new ideas helped him stay innovative and adaptable in an ever-changing marketplace. Alan emphasizes that smart thinking thrives on cross-disciplinary knowledge. The more diverse your learning experiences, the more connections you can make between different ideas. But lifelong learning isn't just about gaining knowledge. It's also about learning how to unlearn. Alan introduces the concept of unlearning as a crucial part of refining smart thinking. Sometimes the information we've held on to for years becomes outdated or irrelevant, and clinging to it can hinder our ability to think effectively. Smart thinkers are willing to let go of old ideas when they no longer serve a purpose. This doesn't mean forgetting everything you've learned, but rather being open to reevaluating your beliefs, methods, and assumptions. For example, imagine you've been following the same business strategy for years, but the market has shifted, and that strategy is no longer working. Instead of stubbornly sticking to what you know, smart thinking encourages you to unlearn that strategy and embrace new methods that are more suited to the current environment. This kind of mental flexibility is essential for long-term success. Next, Alan discusses the importance of reflection as a tool for refining smart thinking. Reflection is the process of looking back on your decisions, actions, and outcomes to understand what worked, what didn't, and why. It's a critical part of learning from experience. Without reflection, you're likely to repeat the same mistakes or miss opportunities to improve. Alan encourages readers to make reflection a regular habit, whether it's at the end of the day, the week, or after completing a major project. One practical way to incorporate reflection into your life is through a reflection journal. Alan suggests writing down key decisions you've made, challenges you've faced, and how you approach them. Then, analyze the outcomes. Did your strategies work? What could you have done differently? By reflecting on your own thinking processes, you gain valuable insights into how to improve in the future. Alan also stresses that reflection isn't just about learning from failures. It's equally important to reflect on your successes. When things go well, ask yourself why. What strategies or thought processes led to that success? By understanding your strengths, you can replicate those actions in future situations. As the chapter progresses, Alan introduces the idea of feedback loops as a way to refine and improve smart thinking. Feedback loops involve getting regular input from others, whether it's colleagues, mentors, or even friends, on how you're thinking and approaching problems. Often, we're too close to our own thinking to see where we might be going wrong. Outside perspectives can provide valuable insights that we might otherwise miss. Imagine you're working on a project and you feel like you've hit a wall. You've thought through the problem as thoroughly as you can, but you're not making progress. This is where feedback loops come in. By sharing your thoughts with someone else and getting their feedback, you might discover a blind spot in your thinking or a new approach you hadn't considered. Smart thinkers actively seek out feedback because they understand that other people's perspectives can help sharpen their own thinking. Alan also discusses the importance of creating a thinking routine. Just like athletes have training regimens to keep their bodies in peak condition, smart thinkers benefit from having routines that keep their minds sharp. This could be something as simple as setting aside 10 minutes each morning to review your priorities for the day, or taking time each week to engage in creative problem-solving exercises. The key is consistency. By making smart thinking a regular part of your routine, you ensure that it becomes a habit rather than something you only do occasionally. In this section, Alan shares an example of a famous CEO who incorporated a daily thinking routine into his schedule. Every morning, before checking emails or jumping into meetings, he spent 20 minutes reviewing the big picture, his long-term goals, the current challenges facing his company, and the steps he needed to take to move forward. This routine allowed him to stay focused on what really mattered and make better decisions throughout the day. But smart thinking routines aren't just for work. Alan encourages readers to develop routines for their personal lives as well. For instance, you might set aside time to reflect on your personal goals, relationships, or health. By applying smart thinking to every area of your life, you create a holistic approach to success. Alan emphasizes that adaptability is a core component of maintaining smart thinking over the long term. Life is unpredictable, and rigid thinking can lead to frustration and missed opportunities. Smart thinkers know how to pivot when needed, adjusting their strategies as circumstances change. He gives the example of a famous company that quickly adapted to changing market conditions by embracing digital transformation, while their competitors, stuck in their old ways, fell behind. Adaptability doesn't mean abandoning your principles or goals. Instead, it means being flexible in how you achieve those goals. Alan explains that smart thinkers remain committed to their long-term vision, but are willing to adjust their approach as new information becomes available. This ability to adapt is what allows them to thrive in the face of uncertainty and change. Toward the end of the chapter, Alan stresses the importance of emotional resilience. The journey of smart thinking is not always smooth. There will be setbacks, failures, and moments of doubt. Emotional resilience is the ability to bounce back from those challenges, to maintain a positive outlook even when things don't go as planned. Alan explains that smart thinkers develop emotional resilience by cultivating a growth mindset, viewing failures as learning opportunities rather than personal defeats. He shares the story of a well-known inventor who faced countless failures before finally achieving success. Instead of giving up, he saw each failure as a step closer to his goal. This resilience, combined with smart thinking, allowed him to keep moving forward, ultimately leading to breakthrough innovations. Alan encourages readers to adopt a similar mindset. Don't let setbacks derail your progress. Instead, use them as fuel to improve and refine your thinking. As the chapter closes, Alan leaves us with a final thought. Smart thinking is a lifelong practice. It's not something you master overnight, and it's not something you can put on autopilot. The world is constantly changing, and the smartest thinkers are those who continually evolve their thinking to keep up with those changes. By embracing lifelong learning, reflection, adaptability, emotional resilience, and a consistent thinking routine, you can ensure that smart thinking remains a core part of your success, both now and in the future. In the end, Alan reminds us that smart thinking isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the most thoughtful, the most curious, and the most adaptable. It's about approaching every challenge with an open mind, a willingness to learn, and a commitment to continuous improvement. With these tools in hand, anyone can become a smart thinker, capable of navigating life's complexities with confidence and clarity.